one of the topics that my mandate research and present a report, as Ona, you mentioned this at the General Assembly, and the report that was really well received. Let me also thank OSHR, ICNL, and the Mesoamerican Initiative of Women Human Rights Defenders for supporting the organization of these virtual events. I would also like to thank my colleague, Dorothy Estrada-Tant, member of the working group on discrimination against women, for joining me today and for continuing our collaboration. Thank you very much, Dorothy, and I really appreciate it. Thank to all panelists, also prominent women from civil society leaders, and thank you for your time, and thank you also for being here today to discuss this important. When I presented my report to the General Assembly in October last year, I stressed that ensuring that women in their diversity can effectively enjoy the right to peaceful assembly is a prerequisite to the advancement of all human rights. Because when women exercise their right to peaceful assembly and have equal access to their rights, all in society benefits. We all do better. While this is not new, women have for generations been key players in the struggle for human rights. The transformative power of current protest movements led by women across the world is simply undeniable. And I think Ona just mentioned some of them currently in Myanmar, where women are in front of this very important revolution to reverse what is unconstitutional, but also what is the violation of fundamental freedom of Myanmar people. Women-led protest movements are pushing all of us to take immediate action to build a more equitable world, to question the status quo. They are at the forefront of the movement for political freedom, fair work, and climate justice. Women protest leaders are the clearest voices today against the secularization of the COVID-19 response. The large demonstration and activism around International Women's Day on March 8th are a clear example of this. On this important day, women led and inspire millions of people to join the feminist movement and focus our attention not only on women's inequality, but also on all the structural inequality that results from the pervasive political, social, and economic injustice. But on this day, women demonstrators become a frequent target of attacks by state and non-state actors. In the context of rising fundamentalism and backlash against gender inequality, these gatherings are particularly at risk in certain parts of the world. Indeed, for all that has changed and all the barriers that have been dismantled across the world, women continue to face barriers and threats to the full enjoyment of assembly rights that are gender intersectional and based in deep-rooted discriminatory social norms. As I explained in my report, women continue to face harmful stereotypes in the family and in the community. They are reminded by parents and community leaders that good girls don't protest. This continues to relegate many women around the world to family role and denies them access to protest rights. During peaceful protests, women continue to be at high risk of sexual harassment, from unwanted sexual remarks to unwelcome sexual behavior and threats of rape. These attacks instill fear and humiliation and impede meaningfully access to public space for association and assemblies. Rape continues to be used as a weapon by state and non-state actors against women who participate in peaceful assembly. The use and threat of rape seeks to terrorize peaceful protesters and scare women away from the streets. Rape against women demonstrators often serve as a warning to other women in their network, collective, and movement. Threats are also common on the digital public sphere. where women activists are not free or safe facing online gender-based violence that continue to go unpunished and unaddressed. Women who face intersecting discrimination and exploitation, particularly on the basis of race, ethnicity, ability, country of origin, and age, are at heightened risk of this form of violence, even more so when their protests challenge misogyny, homophobia, and white supremacy. How do we move forward? But it is a mistake to assume that women movements are waiting for men to change this reality. The Embodiment Women movement is determined to achieve change and assert women's fundamental freedoms. Despite persistent and mounting challenge, women's organizations and movements have shown no sign of relenting. Since I took the mandate in 2018, I met with many of these women in civil society and social movements from across the world, many of them a young generation of women who are determined to occupy the public space and express their view on the future of their country, no matter what it will cost. To support their work, states need first and foremost to move gender equality commitment into action, as I reiterate in my report. They need to accelerate effort to end gender-based violence, which continue to be a major threat to women's rights to freedom of peaceful assembly. We can no longer tolerate repression by police and attacks from non-state actors against women who protest to go ignored and unpunished. And second, we need to do more to support women-led protest movements and ensure they have the resources they need to continue to lead, mobilize, and inspire people around the world to achieve progress in human peace and development. I will explain on this, I will expand in this idea in our discussion. Let me thank you again for being here, and also hope that we will have a very fruitful interaction, but also that from this event, we will also elaborate and discuss about concrete action to move forward in protecting and ensuring that women movement and women in general have the right to peaceful assembly and association. I thank you.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur Voulet. Great introduction to this conversation. Now let me give the floor to expert Dorothy Strada-Tank.
Thank you so much, Ona. And first of all, I would like to thank UN Special Rapporteur Clement Voulet. I'm very glad to share these introductory remarks with him. I would like to thank Ona Flores, ICNL, the OHCHR as well, and Iniciativa Mesoamericana de Mujeres Defensoras de Derechos Humanos. I'm very happy to share this event with you. My name is Dorothy Strada-Tank. As Ona was saying, I am from Mexico. I am a member of the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. And as UN Special Rapporteur was stating, we know that the right of freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, recognized already since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, recognized in Article 20, has since then evolved, and that this right is particularly under threat in the case of women and girls as well, who try to exercise this right, not only under threat in established, or let's say in dictatorial regimes or in countries in transition, but also in established democracies where we thought that this right may have been already safeguarded and guaranteed sufficiently. And we are seeing today that this is not always the case. We know as well that women human rights defenders particularly are under an heightened threat of suffering violence and discrimination while exercising their right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And this aspect has been recognized and emphasized by the working group that I have the honor of belonging to since its very foundation. As you may recall, the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls was created in 2010. It's a relatively recent UN special procedure. And since its very inception, in its first annual report to the Human Rights Council in 2012, the UN Working Group identified women's political and public life as one of its 4 priority themes. And consequently, in 2013, it dedicated its report on public and political life precisely. And there the working group signaled that stigmatization, harassment, and outright attacks have been used to silence and to discredit women who are outspoken as leaders or as community workers, as human rights defenders, as politicians as well. And these ideas were further developed in subsequent reports. In 2015, in its report on cultural and family life, the working group again highlighted the vulnerability to discrimination, to violence, to criminalization of women human rights defenders in exercise of their right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And as well in 2018, in one of the central themes of this event, in its report on reasserting equality and countering rollbacks in 2018, as I said, the working group noted that human rights defenders have been facing serious challenges around the world, driven by deep-rooted discrimination against women, by stereotypes about their appropriate role in society, by intensified rising in fundamentalisms, political populism, unchecked authoritarian rule, and also focus on corporate profit, sometimes to the detriment of in exercise of the right of peaceful assembly, of legitimate concerns, for example, if we think of climate change. In 2019, the working group also focused on this right in its report on women deprived of liberty, where again it signaled and it documented several cases where women human rights defenders have been subject to criminalization and to detention as a result of their exercise of this right and as a result of their engagement in public and political life. Finally, in its 2020 report, the UN Working Group focused on the changing world of work. And here it noticed also a backlash against resistance to women's human rights and certain environment where women's equal participation in economic life has also been challenged. So we see this environment both of revitalization as the participants today will surely give testimony to, but also of pushbacks regarding the right to freedom of peaceful assembly regarding women and girls. And in this scenario, technology can also, of course, play a role, has played a role in enhancing the exercise of these rights. If we think, for example, of using technology to organize women workers, for example, in Latin America, the creation of an app, right, a technological app where women domestic workers exchange information and also mobilize for protest and for demanding their rights. This has been documented in the 2020 report that I mentioned, as well as, of course, the Me Too movement and so many other expressions of protest and of demand of women's human rights, not only to peaceful assembly, but in general regarding gender equality and the right to equality and non-discrimination. Also thinking, as UN Special Rapporteur Boulay was saying, of forms of structural discrimination and violence that are also in the background when we look at this individual right of freedom of peaceful assembly. So I'm sure we can discuss more of these issues in the rest of the session, and I will leave it there. And thank you so much, Ona.
Thank you, Professor Estrada. It's really great because the introduction is really a great segue for the conversation that will start now with our human rights defenders working on the ground in many countries around the world. I would like to start with Osan. Osan, you have been at the forefront of women's rights demonstration in the Philippines, including one of the largest demonstrations on International Women's Day in 2020 in the world. What do you think made the last year's International Women's Day March in the Philippines different from previous years? And what can you tell us about that movement?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ona. First of all, I would like to say that I am based in Manila, Philippines, and last year on International Women's Day, there were tens of thousands of Filipino women who took to the streets across the country, and this is despite the fears of the coronavirus outbreak, which was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization days later. And this is also despite the deadlier violence that is the authoritarianism of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's regime. So on this day, women's rights groups organized protest rallies, dance mobilizations, sit-ins, and dialogues. So how was last year's International Women's Day different from previous years? And I would also like to add, from previous administrations. So it is important to note that there's been a pattern of targeted attacks on Filipino women human rights defenders even prior to last year. The attacks come in many forms, such as the criminalization and attacks on activists of all kinds, women peasants, women labor organizers, women opposition leaders, indigenous women, the LGBTQ+ community, lawyers, journalists, so all are targets. So this is the government's response to the growing power of movements that are demanding economic, social, and cultural rights. So recent examples of these attacks are, the practice of red tagging of legal activists. So often they are government critics. So women are branded as communists without evidence. Another example are the death threats and even the rape threats directed on women activists. So, and there's also the filing of fake charges. So the fake charges come in the form of perjury, murder, arson, kidnapping. So these are the trumped up charges being filed against women. So there were 54 Filipino women human rights defenders reported to have been arrested from January of last year until February of this year. Also, extrajudicial killings of activists are happening, and women activists are among the victims. There were 8 Filipino women human rights defenders killed for political reasons in 2020 alone. So another attack on women activists is the use of political narratives. So these narratives include, justifying extractives and economic projects as positive development, and to portray the resistance of women as something that is backward. So as a consequence, women grassroots leaders and women human rights defenders, especially those coming from the ethnic minorities, those who are environmental defenders, LGBTQ+ activists and women, they're all being discredited and isolated. So other narratives include portraying misogyny as normal, no less than the Philippine president himself, President Duterte. He has fostered a new wave of misogyny, persecution of women's groups, and violation of women's rights. From the beginning of his presidential campaign, President Duterte said misogynist jokes about sexually assaulting women. So he's in fact normalizing the culture of misogyny. In the rural areas, indigenous women have been specifically targeted for sexual violence in conflict zones. And very little has been done by the authorities to respond to complaints. So members of the Lumad, they are the indigenous peoples from Mindanao, the southern part of the Philippines, they have been driven away from their ancestral lands. And rape has been used as a weapon to scare them away from returning to their families. So amidst all of these, there is impunity for repression and violence. In reality, while the Philippines is pretending to be a democratic country, it's actually a military police state. Martial law was declared in 2017 in the south part of the country called Mindanao. And although it was lifted in January 2020, the state of emergency remains. Human rights violations are being committed by the police and the military, and they go unpunished. Also related to the state of emergency in Mindanao, protest actions are still not allowed. So this pattern of targeted attacks on a particular social group, and in this case, women's groups, it is a denial, if not a violation of their rights to peaceful assembly and association. So for example, the biggest grassroots women's alliance in the Philippines, called Gabriela, it has been consistently leading the International Women's Day commemoration in the country. Currently, it has leaders who were charged with criminal cases. Some of these women leaders have been able to post bail, but some had to continue to work and to organize the International Women's Day, but they had to work, under the radar. So more broadly, these patterns are an attack on women's and human rights. And it's very ironic because in the Philippines, we actually have 37 laws that uphold women's rights. But on the ground, what is happening is that there's widespread violence, there's widespread violence in the form of domestic abuse, sexual harassment and rape. And on top of that is the state violence directed against women. So lastly, these attacks are happening in other countries in the region of Southeast Asia. As UN Special Rapporteur Boulay has mentioned earlier, the recent developments in Myanmar with the military coup, protests have become illegal and deadly. Just 3 days ago, there were 18 killed in a protest in Myanmar. Also, Thailand is under martial law. In Cambodia and Indonesia, although there is no outright military rule declared, there are laws and policies that make peaceful assembly and mass organizing difficult. So all of these similarities in context point to the increasing, risks for women activists, not just in the Philippines, but also in many other places in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Oksana. I think that was you managed in 4 minutes to give us an overview on not only Philippines, but the entire Southeast region and the situation of women. And I'm glad you mentioned Gabriela, as I know that's a case that both special rapporteurs have paid attention closely in the last couple of years. So I'm going to turn now, and thank you again, Oksana, I'm going to turn now to Central America. So with Alejandra, after International Women's Day demonstrations last year, most countries in the world implemented lockdowns to respond to the spread of coronavirus. El Salvador faced one of the world's more stringent lockdowns in 2020, with the military on the streets to enforce it. This had serious health and economic impacts on those at the lowest of incomes and in the informal economy, which are predominantly women. And that's very connected to the work of the working group on its latest report on women in the world work. Alejandra would like to share with us a short video of women workers in El Salvador who lost their jobs during the pandemic and are organizing right now and now on strike to reassert their rights. Then Alejandra will tell us about their protest movement and what is particularly unique or special about this struggle. And just so everybody knows, this video is in Spanish, so please turn to the English interpretation channel if you need interpretation. Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
¿Qué queremos las mujeres, compañeras? Derecho que no se reclama. Derecho que se pierde. Eso es lo que queremos, Florencia, y colectivo. Mujeres de resistencia mantiene y la vamos a seguir manteniendo hasta que se nos cumpla.
Aquí había mujeres que solo arrocito pedían, una tortilla, porque también el señor no nos pagaba el salario completo. Nos pagaba $20 a la quincena, 50, y así nos iba adeudando hasta que se empeoró la situación.
Siempre fue una empresa que violó los derechos de los trabajadores, porque no teníamos agua potable, los atrasaban los salarios, el pago de AFP, del Seguro Social, y la sobreexplotación que había.
Yo comencé a trabajar a los 19 años. He trabajado en 3 partes. En las 3 partes han cerrado y siempre nos dicen que van a cambiar las leyes y nunca han cambiado. Y siempre los empresarios siguen haciendo lo mismo, pues, dejando a la gente sin trabajo, sin indemnizarla.
Más de 100 mujeres están los casos circulando desde los primeros laboral hasta los quintos de lo laboral. El objetivo es que se nos pague nuestro pasivo laboral, $500,000 que nos deben a 113 mujeres, y que también queremos oportunidades de trabajo que se nos han negado desde lo que ha sido desde la pandemia, y condenamos el total abandono del Estado, y por eso nosotros hemos tomado la decisión de irnos en una huelga de hambre, haciendo responsable al Estado en las condiciones de salud más graves que ya nos estamos sometiendo.
seguirá organizándome. Yo al principio pues tenía miedo y como dice uno no, a veces verdad, ignora muchas cosas. Ignoraba que existía un código de trabajo, ignoraba que existían mis derechos y he aprendido pues que entre apoyarnos entre mujeres y más organizadas pues podemos vencer cualquier tipo de violación.
Thank you, Alex. And now give the floor to Alejandra. Te dejo la palabra para que nos comentes sobre
Hola,
este caso.
buenas tardes para quienes nos escuchan y nos ven a través de este Zoom en vivo. Quiero empezar agradeciendo a Ona Flores por esta invitación también y por el seguimiento para poder estar en este panel y reconocer también la importancia de que este tipo de espacios se puedan brindar. Y gracias también, Analía, por la traducción. Creo que una de las cuestiones muy importantes que señalar es que en el caso de Mesoamérica, las mujeres defensoras ya venían enfrentando una crisis de derechos humanos, una crisis de violencia, una crisis de un Estado, no solamente, o estados, no solamente agresores o perpetradores de agresiones contra las mujeres defensoras, sino también cómplices de otra serie de crímenes. Por ejemplo, el día de ayer se conmemoraron 5 años del asesinato de Berta Cáceres y hasta el día de hoy sigue sin haber justicia para Berta. En el caso de la pandemia por la COVID-19 que hemos vivido y que seguimos viviendo en gran medida en muchos lugares del mundo, ha sido una posibilidad para profundizar estas crisis y para profundizar las vulneraciones de derechos humanos y la falta de garantías y de cumplimiento de las responsabilidades estatales en materia de derechos humanos. Y sobre todo, el deber que tienen los estados de garantizar el derecho a defender derechos. En el caso de Mesoamérica y concretamente en el caso de El Salvador, voy a compartir algunos datos. Entre marzo y mayo del 2020 registramos 58 agresiones contra periodistas y mujeres defensoras en El Salvador. ¿Por qué menciono este periodo entre marzo y mayo? Porque fueron las semanas de mayor confinamiento, de confinamiento estricto, en el que no estábamos saliendo como cotidianamente lo hacemos. Esa etapa sirvió para que muchos actores sociales, pero muy concretamente funcionarios públicos, agredieran a defensoras y atacaran vía redes sociales. Al inicio se dio como una especie de un retweet o una respuesta por parte del presidente o algún funcionario era suficiente para que una serie de personas o de cuentas falsas empezaran a atacar a defensoras de derechos humanos y periodistas por ser críticas con las medidas que el gobierno estaba tomando en materia de COVID. Pero posterior a ello, eso fue en escalada a amenazas directas que incluso hablan de violencia sexual, que incluso señalan que ya saben dónde viven las defensoras, ya saben dónde viven las periodistas, como una forma de amedrentar su labor. Creo que esto da cuenta de las condiciones en que las periodistas y las defensoras ejercemos derechos en El Salvador. Entre la Asociación Nacional de Periodistas y la Red Salvadoreña de Defensoras, hemos hecho un recuento de al menos 100 agresiones ocurridas durante el año 2020 en el periodo de enero a noviembre de 2020. Para ir cerrando esta etapa de pregunta, solo quiero referirme al caso de las compañeras de Florenci. Son 113 trabajadoras que han enfrentado distintos tipos de violencias, han enfrentado la violencia laboral, ¿verdad? Han enfrentado no solamente el despido, sino también la deuda que su empleador tenía con ellas desde el año 2019, de pagarles salarios incompletos, de no reconocer temas de pensiones y de seguro social. Además, la violencia estructural a la que se han tenido que enfrentar, porque si ya la ciudadanía en general se vio afectada por las medidas de la pandemia, las personas trabajadoras de maquila que tienen salarios mínimos y que incluso son incompletos se vieron todavía más afectadas porque las empresas simplemente cerraron sin dar ningún tipo de salida o ofrecer alguna alternativa. Además, la violencia machista a la que las mujeres defensoras de derechos laborales, en este caso concreto, se han tenido que enfrentar, no solamente en sus núcleos cercanos, familias o comunidades que las estigmatizan por su labor. Muchas de ellas han tenido que enfrentarse también a la violencia machista al interior de los movimientos, porque el movimiento sindical, al menos en El Salvador, como en la mayoría de movimientos, es un movimiento cuyos liderazgos están monopolizados por personas que son del sexo masculino y que su actuar no necesariamente toma en cuenta las realidades concretas de las mujeres. Además, pues lo que ellas ya manifestaban, que es la violencia del Estado. El Ministerio de Trabajo, que tiene una responsabilidad y un deber de ofrecer alternativas y de llamar al empleador para que responda con sus deberes de derechos laborales a las mujeres de Florencia, no les ha respondido. El Ministerio de Trabajo ha guardado silencio y con mucha más razón. Recientemente hemos tenido elecciones en las cuales la mayoría de funcionarios de este gobierno estuvieron todo este periodo anterior haciendo campaña electoral para poder ganar las elecciones y haciendo uso de los recursos estatales para hacer campaña electoral y jugar con las necesidades de la población. Y eso, en gran medida, es el resultado que hemos podido ver el pasado domingo, en el que el gobierno y el partido de gobierno se ha convertido en la primera fuerza política en El Salvador. Y ahora no solamente van a tener control del gobierno central, sino también de la Asamblea Legislativa. Y con ello se consolida una fuerza política que no habíamos visto en El Salvador desde 1985. Con lo cual, siendo este un gobierno de corte neoliberal que tiene características autoritarias, que hace uso de las tecnologías para perseguir, para criminalizar y para estigmatizar a las defensoras de derechos humanos, consideramos que la libertad de asociación para las mujeres defensoras es un derecho que está ahora más que nunca en una situación de riesgo. Gracias.
Thank you, Alejandra. I think that last concern that you raised related to the use of digital technologies, both positive because we're able to learn about the case of the women in the Maquila, you know, very simple by a Facebook link, but also the negative and the threats that they involved. And I want to bring now Hayat and Jan to this conversation. So we're moving from El Salvador now to the Middle East and Southern Africa. And I'll start with Jan. So both regions witness, as the rest of the world, witnessed groundbreaking protest movement against gender-based violence and sexual abuse over the last couple of years. So we saw the hashtags #MeToo, but also Shut It All Down and Am I Next in South Africa recently. What can you tell us about these movements and the role played by digital technologies, both positive and negative? And I'll start with Hayat. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Well, allow me to start with speaking a little bit about the context of movements, because speaking about Lebanon and the Middle East, and mainly in Lebanon. So because when we speak about revolutions, movements, etc., I think that women's place is in all forms of movements, and not only the movements that are related to gender-based violence, because all the time they want to keep us away from the political sphere. But we want to come back and say that this is also our space. So in Lebanon, we witnessed on the 17th of October in 2019 a revolution where thousands of Lebanese poured into the streets of Lebanon to rid the country of decades of corruption and mismanagement. This revolution was also a feminist one, I can say, because it was revolting against a patriarchal and sectarian regime that practiced discrimination and violence against women for decades. And also women were on the front lines of this revolution. Later, this revolution proved rightful against the system, which brought Lebanon, unfortunately, to the brink of economic collapse, which is one of the worst in our modern history, and also an ongoing political and security crisis followed by months of lockdown, as you mentioned, and struggle because of COVID-19 global pandemic. This was worsened, unfortunately, with the massive explosion that erupted in our capital, which is known as Beirut Blast. So after every crisis, women of Lebanon were the first to lead the recovery work and were the first to participate on ground and in the front lines. Because you asked about digital media, I want to focus more on how we made use of digital media in these movements, and also how we were affected by digital media. So we use the digital platforms as a vital vehicle for mobilizing the attention and accountability to women's rights and women's issues. Social media also allowed us as feminist activists and women's rights movement to practice online advocacy, activism. We practiced community building. We increased awareness and engagement around women's rights issues. And also during the times of the pandemic, mainly, it was a really important tool to provide support remotely to women who are in need for support, women survivors of different forms of sexual and gender-based violence. And also we use them to put pressure on the public and private officials to enact a change on all levels on issues related to women's rights. But also, on the other hand, it's worth mentioning, as many of the colleagues mentioned before me, that despite the opportunities that digital media or technology created for us as women human rights defenders, it also introduced us to many challenges. What I can say here is that all types of violence practiced offline, unfortunately, became reflected online. As yet another patriarchal public space. So, for example, in Lebanon, the percentage of reporting online gender-based violence, which ranged from harassment to bullying to extortion, has increased by 180% only during the first months of 2020. And it's worth mentioning that 40% of the victims were girls. We're speaking about girls between 12 and 22 years old. Also, there were many examples of targeting women rights activists fighting for gender equality through hate, bullying, misogynic comments, campaigns, also shaming, exposing personal information, and even some cases of hacking their accounts. So at the time, in brief, at the time that we saw in this digital world as women and women human rights defenders, a space where patriarchal, a space for us to escape from the oppression and express ourselves more freely, it was actually as well a space where patriarchal norms, perpetrators, and also authorities, and there are many examples from the region about this, try to interfere into our lives, and practice different forms of violence, and also dominate us and oppress our opinions and freedom of expression. But yet we are still working and persisting to stay on the digital platforms because it is our right, after all, to be there. Thank you. I will stop here, Anna, and we'll be open to hear any questions.
No, that's great. Thank you, Hayat. And actually, I want to go immediately with you with a follow-up question before I move to Jan. We discussed also when you think of the revolution, Lebanon revolution, and you mentioned before, a lot of people want women just us to be just protesting about
present
gender, and not issues of political. So how do you think the protest in Lebanon challenge those stereotypes, challenge those patriarchal ideas, and also export it to the rest of the world as we all watch women lead revolution in Lebanon?
Exactly. So again, Onna, allow me to speak about the revolution and also other occasions, because in Lebanon, we suffered a lot of crises in the past 2 years. So when speaking about women and girls in Lebanon, we are speaking about the most affected on all levels from these crises, but also we are speaking about frontliners, peacemakers, and response leaders, while unfortunately being excluded from negotiation, decision-making, and also political processes. So in all fields in general, women struggle for equality and fair participation and representation, while they are faced by this pushback and discrimination and social stereotypes, as you mentioned, and also undermining their capabilities, because unfortunately we are still living in a male-dominated world and culture. So at the beginning of the Lebanese revolution, women were judged mainly by media, by how they look and how they are dressed. And this is the stereotype about Lebanese women. Always they point the fingers and look how women in Lebanon are liberated, how do they dress, how do they express. So the focus was on this rather than the actions that these women are taking or the demands that we are calling for. But later, of course, with the persistence to stay in the streets and all the work that was done by the feminist movement to bring women's issues to the streets and to the center of the revolution, and remaining on the front lines, these previous attitudes, we started witnessing that they are changing, mainly in the media and in the perception of the people who were occupying the streets. So we demanded and keep on demanding, during this revolution, the right for protection for women to safely exercise their freedom to express and freedom to assembly across all sides of political landscape, including the revolution, and also for women role in this revolution, and also as peacemakers in the country to be recognized. Also allow me, because as I mentioned, I'm speaking about different occasions where women wanted to be present. At the time, we were faced by pushback and exclusion. So I want to mention just two fast examples from Lebanon. One is related to COVID-19, for example, in order to show how women's issues and women's participation is always excluded and left behind. So during the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis peak times in Lebanon, as we all know, women are the caregivers, they are the doctors, 80% of the nurses, teachers, the ones who are bearing the burdens of paid work and caring for the family members, journalists, frontliners, etc. But when it comes to setting emergency plans, priorities, and needs, women are excluded. For example, in Lebanon, a committee of 7 men was formed to select the goods to be subsidized to control the inflated prices in the country. So they compiled a list of 300 items, but they somehow failed to include the sanitary pads, the period pads. At the time where Lebanon was suffering and Lebanese women were suffering from period poverty, it was prevailing, and there was a lack of resources for them to access period pads. So, and of course, what they didn't forget naturally was the men's razors. So this is one of the examples. And also another example is in the response for Beirut Blast, when the politicians came together to to discuss the situation, put a humanitarian response and the plans, no women were found on the table in these discussions. So for me, I think that it is very important to start this kind of webinar and other discussions related to women freedom of assembly and participation is very important, because I think that based on what I experienced, that the benefits of women's participation in exercising political power cannot be called into question after all these years of struggle and activism. So because it will help to ensure the reforms of discriminatory laws, also conflict resolution, peace building, and also ensuring that the demands of half the population is on the table, and also in addition to building healthy and inclusive societies and advancing human rights. So yes, I hope that I answered your question.
You did, and thank you. And this is, and we're going to invite people to, again, send us questions in the Q&A box, and I'll also share the link of Special Rapporteur Clément's Voulet report when this is something that he addressed in the report as well. And it's great to see, I'm glad that you share some examples that confirm the findings of that report, who explicitly said that women are the front for COVID, but then are excluded at decision making, and that's seen throughout the world. And now I'm going to turn to Jan. Jan, going back, I mean, we're having a good conversation, so feel free to react to what Hayat has been saying here, but also go back to, I know you work at APC, work with a global mandate, but are based in South Africa. So I would like your perspective of these movements around the world, but especially in Southern Africa, and the role played by technologies.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everybody for staying. I think I was just reading an article about everyone having Zoom fatigue. So I thought today I have to do something to counter my Zoom fatigue. So yeah, little stretch if you need it. So as Anna said, I'm Jan and I work at the Association for Progressive Communications. And our focus really is looking at the role of technology in social justice. And so I always find it very interesting that the most common example in relation to freedom of assembly and association in the context of women's rights online is Me Too. Because while it occupied a big part of the public imagination, Me Too was actually very late in the game if we think about local organizing, and if we think about the extent to which smaller institutions, collectives, informal networks of women particularly have been using technology in very innovative ways. So I want to take us back a little bit further than Me Too to a big piece of organizing that happened in South Africa that was using the hashtag Rape Must Fall. And Rape Must Fall really was a movement that was started and pushed by women, university students on a range of campuses who were calling for accountability from university structures to very high levels of sexual violence, including rape and harassment, and it was happening with impunity. No one was doing anything about it. And I want to give this example because it raises three things that I don't think we often reflect on. The first thing is that this movement drew on the language of other movements. So in South Africa, we had huge student protests 2 years before that used a hashtag called Fees Must Fall. It had great visibility. It was a youth movement. It had success. So the language of must fall resonated with a much bigger community of people, not only those of us who were concerned with ending violence. So there's something there around how technology has the possibility to connect networks just through recognition. And that's something that I think we really should pay attention to. The second piece was that it also used a completely different hashtag, which was called I Am Kanga. And the word Kanga is very significant in South Africa because it reminds us of an infamous rape trial of our now former president. So again, something about public memory that can really be used to drive movements, drive issues. And so what the point I want to make around this is around how technology is able to locate movements, both historically as well as in the contemporary. And this is important, I think, especially in a moment now. If I'm just thinking about what our colleague from the Philippines spoke about, things are happening with such impunity that we sometimes feel so powerless. And I think if we think about technology and digital technologies in particular as a way for us to remember, it links very strongly to the power of memory as resistance. Here in South Africa, we often speak about as long as you can remember, you can resist. So there's something about archiving, memory, connecting to other movements, which really holds a lot of potential. And of course, the last point, which I think others have already raised, really is around this local global connection, yeah, the immediate resonance of particular kinds of issues that historically we wouldn't have been able to make those connections necessarily. So there's something, yeah, so these things are happening. And I think it points us to some of the opportunities that we have, especially in contexts where face-to-face organizing actually simply is not possible. It's not possible because certain identities are criminalized. It's not possible because you literally are unable to move, again, as we heard just now. And I think this point about global, local solidarity in relation to how we organize is important, because sometimes the people who are most affected are not the ones who are able to assemble peacefully. And if they do, they bring greater risk to themselves. So there's also safety in this idea of disparate but connected movements and organizing. And then I also just wanted to speak a little bit about the challenges. And I'm not going to talk about online gender-based violence because I think it's an issue that we all are very aware of and I think have a much better understanding of how this works. I did want to mention two things, though, in relation to that. No, I am going to talk about online gender-based violence. Okay. The first thing is around the who. Colleagues also just now spoke about targeted attacks. And this notion of targeted implies there is a level of organization. And the organization is not always just, oh, well, because I share a particular opinion with you, but often they are funded by state and non-state actors. We hear of cyber armies, we hear of trolls, and in very particular and deliberate ways to silence. And the second point I wanted to make in relation to that is also to pick up on something that our colleague from the Philippines spoke about, which is the use of political narratives by the state. What we know about social media is that we often hear what we want to hear. And this, again, very targeted, deliberate, visibilizing and noise around particular political narratives definitely has very negative consequences for women human rights defenders in particular. And it isn't only the narratives of women should not do this, you know, it's not only those, the ones that are around kind of gender and sexual identity, but we're hearing more and more of narratives that relate to things like they are actually against the economy, exactly what we heard just now. They don't care about the people. So underlying this is a narrative of really pronounced nationalism. And I think that's emerging much more strongly in relation to work around climate justice. So I think it's, yeah, there's just some attention that we need to be paying there quite carefully. I want to just give a few other examples of the challenges that we have. And the one is really around the cost of access and being online. I have a pet hate the words, we have successfully pivoted to working online. It is not true. We have not successfully pivoted because many people can't afford access. Many people's infrastructure is so poor they can't use video. And the issue of access and connectivity is a really significant one if we are really to use the benefits of digital technologies to support peaceful assembly. Other issues relate to things like internet shutdowns. If there is no internet, there's nothing we can do, you know? And I think, again, we need to pay attention to these kind of peripheral issues, but they might appear to be peripheral, yet they really are at the heart of our ability to participate. Also very important is legislation that's criminalizing dissent online. And a very horrible example is the persistent harassment and I think eventual charging of Maria, I think it's Ressler, a journalist in the Philippines, working for the editor of Rappler newspaper. So we're seeing this, it's embedded in the legislation, you see it in the outcome, and all of these kind of connections are very significant. Another key issue is takedowns and blocking content, which brings in a very important point around other actors. And in this instance, the actors are the private sector and social media companies. And just last two really is looking at the concerns around surveillance of women human rights defenders and defenders at large. And that's both mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. And lastly, of course, is the issue of crack down on the kinds of tools that historically used to keep us safe, using encryption, for example, or using virtual private networks. In many countries, this is now illegal. So even the possibilities that digital technologies have allowed us for participation and assembly increasingly are being eroded. And I will stop there because I also need a drink of water from this big talking. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So we have a context of obviously the COVID pandemic is still with us, and there's restrictions, many of them, some of them legitimate, for gathering on the street, especially mass gatherings like the one we saw in 2020. We have targeted online attacks directed at women's human rights defenders, in particular groups within that. We have internet shutdowns that are popping up everywhere. We have a context of criminalization mentioned by digital divides. We have a context of exclusion. I'm being in the list of all that's been mentioned. Clémence Voulet, obviously the 10 years of this is all being mapped pretty clearly in the 10 years of work of the working group and in many, many reports. And then most recent, Clémence Voulet also made an effort in 20 pages to try to condensate all that work in one. So I'm getting all of you. I want to bring all the panelists here, whoever wants to speak, to the next question. So next week is International Women's Day. On Monday, I've heard from many women that many are still planning to go on the street. Others are just going to be active online, the ones they can. So what do you think are the biggest challenge for next week, and what should be special rapporteurs that we have here paying attention to? And I want to start with Osang, if you want.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. The trends of attacks on women that I mentioned earlier are aggravated by the current context. The pandemic has affected many countries in the Southeast Asian region and the rest of the world. Pandemic has aggravated poverty and inequality and the already difficult situation that most women are in. So the lockdown, the state of emergency measures, these are all highly detrimental for women in many communities. The pandemic has also exposed the ineffectiveness of government leaders, the militaristic nature of some government responses, particularly in the Philippines, and how some governments are using the pandemic to gain more power by suppressing basic rights and freedoms, including the right to peaceful assembly. So in the Philippines, we see more brazen human rights violations in the rise of killings, arrests, fake charges, vilification of human rights defenders, including women human rights defenders, as I mentioned earlier. The Philippines had one of the longest lockdowns in the world, and yet this did not at all address the COVID-19 pandemic. This is proven by the fact that the Philippines ranks as number 2 in Southeast Asia in terms of the number of COVID-19 positive cases, second only to Indonesia. So we currently have more than 500,000 COVID-19 positive cases. So instead of addressing the COVID-19, what we are experiencing in the Philippines is the worsening human rights violation. Hundreds of people were arrested for allegedly violating lockdown rules. Some were put in cages. Men and women were made to stand in the heat of the sun for hours. And there were even verified reports of women being asked by the police for sex in exchange for being allowed to pass through checkpoints. So we call that sex for pass scheme. And these women victims of these, they are afraid to come out in the open and to file cases against the police for fear of reprisal. So another important challenge is the passage of the anti-terrorism law in the Philippines. It was passed in June 2020. And since then, many more women activists have been arrested and killed. So within only 2 months since the anti-terrorism law has been implemented, we have seen dozens of illegal arrests and trumped-up charges against government critics. So women activists have also experienced new and heightened levels of political persecution. So there are now initiatives led by civil society groups, including groups of human rights lawyers that aim to question the constitutionality of this anti-terrorism law. So according to the social and justice group, the law defines terrorism in a vague manner, and that suffers from an absolute lack of conceivable parameters, and it thus violates due process. So in essence, this new anti-terrorism law, it poses a chilling effect on the right to freely associate. So in summary, the Philippine government is using the laws, circumventing the laws to justify the crackdown, not just on the women's movement, but also on all critics. Philippine President Duterte's regime, it has targeted democratic institutions and civil society organizations and declared war on women, adding new levels of patriarchy to chronic disempowerment that women experience. So these are some of the most important challenges that we're facing ahead of the International Women's Day on Monday: increasing poverty, increasing violence, and human rights violations. So these are happening not just in the Philippines, but also in the rest of Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Elsa. And I will just bring Alejandra, because of sake of time, we have 50 minutes left, and I want to bring more the conversation of perspective. But if you can shortly say, what do you expect for next week, Alejandra, in less than 1 minute, if you don't mind.
Bueno, creo que el desafío es volver a aparecer en el espacio público. Obviamente tomando medidas de bioseguridad, distanciamiento. Algunos países no están hablando de marchas, sino de concentraciones. Pero sí, para nosotras es importante como movimiento feminista, sobre todo en la región mesoamericana, volver a aparecer en el espacio público, colocar nuestras demandas, sobre todo en un contexto como el que hemos dicho anteriormente. Nicaragua con un gobierno autoritario, militarista, asesino. Honduras con un gobierno corrupto impune, El Salvador, Guatemala en similares circunstancias, México. Creo que el desafío es poner en el espacio público nuestras demandas, seguirnos cuidando, y obviamente hay un debate, ¿verdad? Siempre sobre si somos responsables de los contagios o no, pero son las políticas públicas de los países las que deben de determinar y tomar las medidas necesarias para evitar estos contagios y para darnos las vacunas, pero todavía no han llegado, o si están llegando no hay claridad del plan de vacunación, por ejemplo. Entonces creo que para nosotras es importante tomar medidas de bioseguridad, pero sí volver a aparecer en el espacio público y no dejar de señalar que nuestros cuerpos, nuestras demandas y nuestras luchas deben de estar al centro y deben de ser reconocidas como deberes que el Estado también tiene de garantizar esos derechos. Y creo que el llamado también, y aprovechando que están aquí relatores y miembros del grupo de trabajo sobre la mujer, creo que es importante que de los distintos espacios se llame a los estados a ocupar su lugar. Y el lugar de los estados es proteger el derecho a defender derechos y el derecho que tenemos como ciudadanía organizada a criticar, a ejercer la Contraloría Ciudadana y a colocar nuestras demandas.
Gracias, Alejandra. Y en esta conversación vamos a pasar a esto. Quería dirigir, hay una pregunta en el Q&A. Oh, sorry, I'm speaking in there is a question in the Q&A that I want to address to expert Dorothy Estrada, given that they have a recent report on arbitrary detention and women. And come on, also, of course, Rapporteur Voulet, feel free to jump in. The question is, does the right to freedom of assembly to women extend to, protection against discriminatory actions based on their gender, like invasive body searches, taken against them if they were subject to arrest and imprisonment? So I'll give you the floor, Dorothy, first to address that.
Thank you, Ona. Yes, of course, I think invasive body searches, of course, fall under, if that is carried out, it's, of course, a violation of women's human rights to physical and psychological integrity, to liberty, to dignity, and so on. But I do want to stress that the report of the Working Group on Women Deprived of Liberty is not only concerned with arbitrary detention. Of course, that's one of the concerns, but it also goes to the root causes of detention of women. So we have cases where, from a formalistic point of view, of following the positive norm, from a legalistic, formalistic point of view, women may be detained, but under what is unjust or discriminatory laws or practices. So while the detention may be formally legal, it may be in violation of human rights standards, principles. The law in itself may be discriminatory, or as I said, its implementation in practice. So I think we have to, when speaking of women deprived of liberty, processes of discrimination, stigmatization, criminalization, look at this broader picture of the root causes, of the background setting, of these structural situations of gender inequality, but also socioeconomic inequality and lack of social justice that, of course, may bring women and girls, and particularly women under different situations, to be deprived of their liberty. Let's also look not only at criminal detentions, but also at what is formally administrative detentions, but that affects undocumented migrants, for example, undocumented migrant women and girls. So I'd like to give this broader picture of that report and of this concern when we speak of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly for protesting against these phenomena of discrimination, and not only to look at the precise situation of a formal deprivation of liberty.
Thank you. I will have to look again to that report, and I think we share the link also for everybody to access to all the annual reports of the working group. And well, before we conclude, I want to share a video. So as we look forward, this next step, we have 15 minutes to finish and think about next week, but also next year and hopefully the next decade. And we have a video of Lucia Lagunes. She's one of Mexico's most important journalists and women human rights defenders, and she will share with us a strategy civil society put in place last fall to ensure women could peacefully assemble on November 25th, which is the International Day of Ending Gender-Based Violence. And this is in the context of COVID. And then I want all of your reactions. This will trigger a conversation of what, in your experience, are effective strategies to ensure women's right to peaceful assembly is protected on International Women's Days, and of course, all other gatherings that will surely happen throughout the year. Thank you. And this video again in Spanish.
El pasado 25 de noviembre, ante el incremento de campañas de estigmatización hacia el movimiento feminista y de acciones violentas contra desde la Red Nacional de Defensoras y de la Red y de la Iniciativa Mesoamericana de Defensoras, tomamos la decisión aquí en México de articularnos y tomar acciones preventivas para precisamente contrarrestar posibles atentados y agresiones contra las mujeres defensoras. Es así que varias organizaciones nos reunimos, entre ellas la Red Nacional de Defensoras, la Iniciativa Mesoamericana, CEGIL, entre otras, y a partir de un análisis de contexto de lo que estaba ocurriendo en México y a partir de esta revisión es que decidimos tomar acciones preventivas y llamar sobre todo a las autoridades a tomar acciones para evitar confrontamientos y acciones represivas contra las movilizaciones que se estaban preparando rumbo al 25 de noviembre, Día Internacional, para eliminar las acciones, la violencia contra las mujeres. Así pues que cada una de las instancias de gobierno recibieron una comunicación por parte de estas organizaciones solicitando que de acuerdo a su mandato pudieran tomar acciones. Es decir, un ejemplo, en el caso de la policía se pidió por favor que no se llevaran las armas ni toletes para si es que pensaban acudir a las manifestaciones que se preparaban y que de preferencia no se colocaran en las zonas principales donde se iban a pasar precisamente las marchas feministas, sino que estuvieran en las calles alternas, de tal manera que la presencia de la policía no fuera un elemento de provocación para estas movilizaciones que se estaba planeando. Llamamos y hablamos con las instancias pertinentes precisamente para acordar acciones preventivas como las que he descrito. Y afortunadamente lo que logramos efectivamente es que reaccionaran, que se pusieran precisamente alertas y evitar efectivamente que el 25 de noviembre pasara cualquier otra acción agresiva contra las defensoras. Defender derechos humanos, poder organizarnos y para precisamente hacer las exigencias hacia las autoridades para cumplir con el respeto y la promoción de los derechos humanos es precisamente uno de los derechos que tenemos y que como defensoras y que no queremos perder en ningún momento. Así que esto es lo que hemos trabajado de manera muy puntual con las autoridades y nos parece fundamental precisamente tomar esta buena práctica, esta lección positiva que hemos desarrollado desde las defensoras en articulación con otras organizaciones, lo cual es muy importante, y estableciendo un diálogo muy preciso con demandas muy concretas a cada autoridad, dependiendo, insisto, del papel que juegan dentro del gobierno. Así que me parece que este es un buen aprendizaje que hemos desarrollado desde la Red Nacional de Defensoras y la iniciativa Mesoamericana.
Well, thank you. I thought that was a very interesting experience by women in civil society, in women human rights defenders from Mexico. So I want to open the floor to ideas of a strategy. It could be something that you carry now from your work or experience that the special rapporteurs have encountered. So I could, let me, bring to the floor Hayat, maybe. And then I will ask you, we're at the end. So, I think if you can use 3 minutes or so of your time, we'll go by that order. Haya, then Osan, then Alejandra, Jan, then we'll give the floor to the rapporteurs, Dorothy and Clement. Thank you.
Sorry, on the connection issues in Lebanon, the line was cutting. Can you please repeat the question?
Sorry, the question is really what are strategies that by your experience would work to protect women on the ground that when are mobilized, and either by carry that are by female or other women's on the ground during the revolution. If you can share with the audience those experiences, and I've asked everybody to share those.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I think one of the main strategies is to persist on our presence and participation and our place in every political sphere in the revolution, because at every time we will face any pushback, we should be replying to it by more participation and also by more advocacy to our right being present and on the ground. I think that one of the important things that we have to do is to mobilize more around women's issues and women's participation in all spaces, and create a kind of solidarity, the kind of campaigns that you mentioned, like the Me Too and other campaigns. One of the main issues why they succeeded and continued is this platform of solidarity that they created for women, and also a space to speak up and to mobilize over their issues. And also there is a lot of work to be done on pressuring the government and pressuring the security forces in order to ensure more protection for women who are exercising their right to be.
Thank you, Hayat. We did get you at the end, but I can.
Yes, I was at the last point I was saying is that there is also a need to pressure the governments and also the police in order to ensure women's protection and not using violence while we are participating, and not using violence against anyone, and especially women human rights defenders when exercising the right to demand any rights or protest or make any movement against violence or exploitation.
Thank you, Hayat. Osan?
Yeah, Ona, this year we expect to see human rights violations that will escalate further in the Philippines. There may be more fake charges to be filed and illegal arrests of women activists leading the International Women's Day. But we also expect that the spirit of resistance of women will remain high. Women are actually generating resistance and organizing that is courageous, creative, and persistent. So for us in JAS, movement building is key. No? Movement building that also incorporates collective protection, given the increasingly hostile context we are in. Movement building is a long-term deep work that requires sustained support. So from our conversations with women and human rights defenders, and from my experience as an organizer in the past, the best strategy is still organizing in communities. The power to change the situation is always in the hands of the people, so we need more organized communities to change things. We have to strengthen ourselves internally, we have to strengthen our organizations internally, and at the same time, strengthen our international solidarity work. We need to sustain and build alliances at the local, at the regional, and at the international level so that we can better support women on the ground. So this includes greater engagement with UN mechanisms, with the UN Special Rapporteurs, including Special Rapporteur role, who leads the initiatives on upholding the right to peaceful assembly. Thank you all.
Thank you, Osan. Alejandra.
Hola, yo creo que de cara a lo que se viene del 8 de marzo, una cuestión importante para nosotras tiene que ver con la construcción de planes o medidas de protección a nivel interno, al interno de las manifestaciones, de las movilizaciones. Cuidarnos porque no necesariamente los cuerpos uniformados o representantes del Estado representan para nosotras una posibilidad de diálogo o una posibilidad de protección. Creo que experiencias como las que ha comentado Lucía Lagunes son experiencias muy, muy buenas, son experiencias también que han podido ocurrir quizás en otro gobierno, pero con el gobierno actual, en el caso de El Salvador, en el caso de Nicaragua, en el caso de Honduras, es muy difícil. Creo que Centroamérica está entrando en esta etapa de un retorno a los gobiernos autoritarios. Es como volver a la década de los 70, de los 80, donde los gobiernos son gobiernos autoritarios y militarizados. Entonces, para nosotras, las estrategias pues también tienen que ver con cómo fortalecemos las organizaciones de base, cómo nos acuerpamos, cómo las distintas luchas pueden colocarse como unas luchas compartidas, no necesariamente mujeres en temas de mujeres o personas LGTBI en temas de LGTBI o temas ambientalistas o temas de derechos laborales, sino una confluencia de todas las luchas y acuerparnos en esas luchas y cuidarnos entre nosotras y nosotros. Creo que por ahí una de las medidas también es mantener estos espacios de diálogo a nivel internacional, a nivel regional. Las redes mismas de defensoras son justamente esa experiencia de las redes salvan vidas, las articulaciones como la iniciativa mesoamericana que generan herramientas de protección entre nosotras es también una respuesta y es una estrategia necesaria en todas las regiones del mundo. ¿Cómo nos cuidamos nosotras las defensoras frente a unos estados que no nos protegen, que no cumplen con su responsabilidad, sino que todo lo contrario, son en su mayoría quienes mayoritariamente ejercen agresiones contra las defensoras, que nos ponen en riesgo, que no consideran que nuestra labor sea importante, sino nos ven como una oposición únicamente o nos estigmatizan y nos criminalizan. Entonces, frente a esto, creo que mayor organización, mayor capacidad de cuidarnos entre nosotras y mayores posibilidades de establecer vínculos y tender redes más allá de las luchas cotidianas, sino cómo hacemos un conglomerado de todas esas luchas para cuidarnos y para resistir frente a los gobiernos y las ciudadanías también que le dan más poder a estos gobiernos, que creo que eso también es importante.
Gracias, Alejandra. Thank you. And then I'll give the floor to Jan.
Thanks. So much has been said already. So I agree with everything that others have said, but to focus specifically in the area of work that we work, just to say that I think that next week we're going to hear a lot of voices, including voices of anti-rights actors, who are going to flood our timelines with the kinds of narratives that we know are not useful to support our movements. So the first thing I would say is let's also flood timelines with messages of joy and solidarity and power, and calling on the history and the people whose shoulders we stand on. Because we are definitely at a moment that requires a kind of collective response. And I think another thing, I don't know why I'm being so practical, is simply because we've been speaking about how there are so many more organized attacks against our work online, Zoom bombing, I guess just for us also to remain quite alert in our celebration and in our move towards a kind of celebration, because I think we need it now, but it also needs to be done with some caution. But mostly I'm saying celebrate. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. We definitely all need to be in that moment of celebration. And then I'll give you for Dorothy to also share your perspective and be mindful that we're concluded, so you can have also the floor to conclude.
Thank you, Ona. I agree as well with everything that has been said. And I would just like to highlight 2 points which I think are important for next week and in general in our movements and human rights challenges. And that is to take the perspective that has been emphasized already in terms of, one could say, bottom-up strategies from a feminist human security perspective, saying organize, mobilize together, solidarity, which of course I agree with. And in that stance, I think we should also emphasize all human rights, because if there ever was a time in this COVID and hopefully soon post-COVID world to emphasize the universality, indivisibility, interdependence of all human rights, right to peaceful assembly, but right to water, to health, to education for everyone, and particularly for those in a more disadvantaged situation, this is the time, because COVID has exposed the cracks and the enormous deficiencies of our systems. So this is a time to, as Alejandra was saying, to reclaim the position of the state also in all of these economic and social rights that facilitate the exercise of women and girls' rights. So I would also call for the unity in terms of the thematic things that we are asking for, of all human rights. And then the second point is a more, let's say, top-down strategy, if you wish, in terms of institutional, legal, and political changes. That we should strive, I think, for gender parity as well, to have women at the table. These examples, like the one Hyatt was giving, are just, outrageous. I mean, we have to have women at the table, women and girls' voices as well being heard, and that passes through the filter of having institutional reforms, which can also ensure women's presence in discussions, in access to power, in access to opportunity. So I also think in pair, these two complementary movements are necessary for Monday, but in general for the struggle for women and girls' human rights. Thank you, Ona.
Thank you, Dorothy. And with that, I think I give the floor to Clement Boulet. Thank everybody for staying. A little bit of a wait time, but not too much. Clement, I think, for you to address the question and conclude this webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very, very much, Ona. I think I just wanted to mention quickly 2 things. For me, in terms of way forward, and as I mentioned in my report that I present to General Assembly, I think it's a time now for the international community and donors also to think about how they can support and create an environment to support women movements, not just a kind of funding that is yearly funding, but also multi-year funding, which are more oriented in gender transformative. Because what I saw from my meeting, from the mission, from country visit, is that there is a lot of local women movement that are not able to have necessary resources. But when you look at those movements, they are those who are close to the community. They are those who are really transforming the community, also helping the community really to keep peace, but also to kind of fight against inequality. So, and I made this call in my report that it's important to really set up system that allows those, in particular those NGOs that work at the local level, to receive those multi-year funding so that they are able to prepare, but also to push agenda forward. Because when you have this kind of yearly funding, sometimes that you don't know if it's coming, it kind of disrupts many movements at the local level because they are not able to plan. And I made this clear. And in particular, also, we know that from many discussions that I have, that a lot of unregistered NGOs at the local level is also led by women. So it's important also to set up a system that allows those unregistered NGOs to receive. What do not need to take in account is not the piece of paper that they have, but how those NGOs are really transforming the community, how they are really helping the community. And I think for me, it's really important, besides the legal environment that states need to put in place. We have also piece that the donors community need to play in ensuring that those women are able also to do their work properly. And the second thing is in relation to the Women's Day that is coming up. I think I would like also to address quite quickly a message to my fellow men to say that I think we need to understand that the feminism is not about women gaining and men losing. No, it's about really men and women coming together to build a society, a peaceful society, where a society that recognizes the rights of all, that everybody is equal, that they recognize also the value of women. And we have to be, and I think that I'm feminist, because I want also my doctor, I want also my daughter, I want my mom, I want my sister also to be able also to live in society where their rights are recognized, where they can go on the streets to express their freedom and come back home safely. And I think if we all understand that, we are all feminists and we have to join this movement. We have to support this movement because this movement is about the transformation of society in peaceful society. And I think until we are able to give women the place that they have in society, recognize their places, recognize their full rights in society, we will not be able to build a society that is equitable society and peaceful society. I think this message needs to go clear, and I'm sometimes really struggle to see how when I saw the police and I saw law enforcement repressing such movements that are calling for peaceful society, are calling for the right thing to do in society. So I think for me it's important to reiterate those messages and to say that we all need to join the movement. We all need to support the movement because this movement aims to build a peaceful society. And another thing I want also to stress quickly is also that the report that I presented at the General Assembly, I'm also working to produce an implementation tools, which I hope really that it can help states, but also help civil society also to ensure that states create the conducive, the measure at the national level to allow women to exercise their full rights of participation, their full rights of association and assembly. And I hope that this tool will be really popularized. It will reach women at the grassroots level so that we are able really to change what we are seeing today. And I want also to end maybe thanking you, Ona, for your really fantastic moderation. But also thanks also Julia and Alexander they were here also. They really helped us because behind this team you can see that many people work to make this possible, and all the teams that really helped to put this side event together. But also thanking all of you for this fantastic experience that you share here and everything. And I hope that next year when we will be sitting around this screen, I mean, it wouldn't be around this screen, but let's say around this table again, we will talk about really things that change since then. We can talk about them. And I think it's important. COVID-19 today really shows us that we need to give women the important place they play. When we were in the middle of really this kind of big challenge, a lot of women were those who are supporting communities, were those who are supporting them. So we need to value the women. We need to value their contribution to the peaceful society. So I sincerely thank you for sharing your experience and hope that next year we will come here and share really a very, very good story, and also maybe give some mark for some country that did the best. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and let's celebrate on Monday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you, Anna and all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Thank you, the
everyone.
interpreters too. The interpreters, thank you so much.
Sí,
Gracias.
muchísimas gracias. Gracias.